right. Happy Tuesday. It's Tuesday, March 23rd. Happy Tuesday, everybody. We are back with another episode of Learning Tech Talks, where we are exploring the landscape of learning tech while cutting through the fluff and answering the questions. I don't even remember how I finished that. But anyway, it doesn't matter because I'm joined by the brotherly duo, David and Taylor Blake. And you know what? We're going to be talking about upskilling, but kind of in a different flair, while at the same time hearing more about their newest venture, Learn-In, which I think pretty much anybody listening has probably heard or seen something about, but may not know quite what it is. So we're going to demystify that while having a lot of fun in this conversation. But before we do, like we always do, we got to warm things up, get people comfortable. And just so you know, everybody watching, listening, you should play along as well. So David and Taylor, we're going to start with an easy one. We're starting with a slow pitch. So where are you in the world today? I'm going to go do the opposite of what I usually do. I'm going counterclockwise. So Taylor, you're up first.
All right. I'm here in Salt Lake City, Utah, which Dave is close, nearby. We're about 40 minutes away.
Don't spoil it. Look at you.
I know, right?
Okay. All right. You know what's funny is I always just love asking, like, where are you in the world today? And then seeing how people answer, because sometimes it's just I'm in Salt Lake City, Utah. And then other times you get the whole story behind it. So anyway, let's switch it over. Now, David, it's your turn, although we kind of know, but you can get more specific.
So part of the great COVID migration. So after 10 years in San Francisco, moved back home to a suburb of Salt Lake City. So both Taylor and I grew up out here, and so this is where the roots are.
Really? Okay, so that, Taylor, we've talked before, and I did not know that part of things. So I didn't know that was where you grew up, and then you went to California, so now you came back. All right, learning so many new things, and so is everyone else. All right, so the next one, we're staying on the family topic. So this one's going to be fun, but I'm going to reverse the order. And you know what? If you're watching, you can comment in too, because it's always fun to hear what everybody else is doing. But let's start with this one. David, what is your favorite sibling childhood memory? And while I didn't specifically state in the rules, you have to do the sibling that's on the show with you.
Yeah, that's true.
I didn't say that. So let's see where you go with it.
This is, we'll tell you a little bit about Taylor, who I know you've gotten to know a little bit over the years. But so I'm older of the two of us brothers. So I'm second of five. Taylor is fourth of five.
Okay.
So he had the advantage. So we're competitive, and there aren't that many things 6 years apart where we got to compete head to head. So he didn't get to prove his dominance or dunk on me on the basketball courts or any of that growing up, because we were separated by 6 years. But our ACT scores were a very clean, delineated way of kind of proving, who's actually top rung. And so he had the advantage because I went first, and so he knew what number he had to beat. But it'll also tell you a lot about Taylor. He will he's efficient. He'll do the minimum amount required to get the outcome desired. And so Taylor studied just hard enough to beat me by 1 point and then stop. And, so that's that. Taylor bested me in the ACT.
Okay, so Taylor gets to respond to this one.
Yeah.
But I love that it's like, it wasn't like I just want to crush it and see how. It's just, I'm going to beat you by one
a little
point.
bit, just a little bit. Yeah, and the trend actually continued. For whatever reason, that was a good quantifiable measuring stick. So as you go younger among the siblings, they each generally bested each other by just a little bit.
Just a little bit. Okay. Yeah. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, Taylor, you're up. Favorite sibling memory?
Oh, favorite sibling memory. With Dave, since he's on here, I mean, Dave made my life so much easier. And I'm not sure I've ever really thanked him for it. And it's because every night I'd be, laying in my bed, and I'd hear Dave come into the house at, who knows what time, way too late. And I always got to listen to him get an earful from my parents, which meant that by the time I was a teenager, Dave had just pushed the boundaries so that for me, by comparison, I was just the easy child, the angel. Always got into a little bit of trouble, but never as much trouble as Dave.
Never as much as Dave. And he set the
For
bar.
the record, our parents have never called Taylor an angel. So that's revisionist history.
Yeah. But
Got it.
Older siblings, do get to take the
We do, right? I'm the oldest, and that's what we do. We set the bar, we push the limit, and then everybody else can kind of come in behind, and they've got an easier path. So look at that. Look at that. We set the gratitude right there. So now we got to hear it on both ends. So I'll share. So we were talking about this before we came live. So my brother's 10 years younger than me, almost 10. And he actually helps me with the show and this other stuff too. So we kind of work together in some regards. So I had a bunch of them actually. So I was actually having a hard time picking which one that I was going to think back to. But I think one of them that really stood out was we were big into Nintendo 64, like back in the day when Nintendo 64 was the thing. And we used to play Diddy Kong Racing all the time. I love Diddy Kong Racing. But the thing that I think he kind of liked it. He's maybe on, so maybe he'll comment in and answer this one. But I think it drove him nuts, but at the same time, he kind of liked it. If you remember Diddy Kong Racing, you could fly, okay? And so you could fly these planes, and I would fly way ahead and get super far ahead and be on the last lap right before the end game, and I would wait. And then I would turn and go backwards with missiles, and I would just eradicate him. Like, I would not let him get to the finish line. And then right before he would get close enough, then I would quick cross the line and take first. And it was so much fun for me. I don't know if it was very fun for him. He laughs about it to this day. But again, I think the Nintendo 64 thing was kind of our thing. So we had that. All right, let's transition over before we end up talking too much about our trips down memory lane. And let's talk a little bit about this because I'm curious, and I'm sure everyone else is too. So you both were involved with Degreed, and now you're doing learning. You're in this disruptive learning HR tech space. Was that something that back, when you were fighting over ACT scores and things like that, that you dreamt that, hey, maybe one day this is what we're going to do? Or how did that end up becoming something that the two of you ended up getting involved in? And I won't direct that at anyone. So
you probably expect the answer to be, know who's thinking about starting an ed tech company when they're teenagers, but we'll let Dave tell his story because it very much was on his mind.
So I mean, talking about the ACT, I do point at the ACT as the catalyst, which when I sat for it, I just thought this is crazy that this is how we sort everyone in and out of their futures. So I'd never once thought about like the future of education or my career going into education or learning until that moment. But it really did throw me. And I went to the library. I tried to find books on it, and I started trying to do research and study. I didn't find a lot, to be honest. This was pre-Google, but I found a lot of history catalog. Yeah, exactly. The Dewey Decimal System.
Exactly.
That's about where we were. I'm just old enough. And so that summer, after I graduated, I wrote a business plan on a university of the future.
Okay.
And still have it to this day. And so, I mean, I've been thinking about it kind of ever since. So okay. Sort of when I was 17 and a half. Now that said, never thought I would, never thought exactly would find myself working in like corporate L&D. I mean, it's, okay. I've fallen in love with problems, and they take me places.
Okay. Okay. So it kind of did. So it was like you took this test, which mine was, I had a similar feeling. Like when I went to college, I remember being like, this, I just can I like do something and get the degree, but why do I have to go through all these other ridiculous steps type of thing? So, okay. So it started with the standardized test. You went, I want to fix it. Taylor, how did you get pulled into it then?
I was a much more normal teenager.
Much more normal.
Didn't think about the education system except, my tiny role in it. But I think, nearing the end of my 4-year college experience, it was this really, I think, harsh transition, which makes you think about some of these things, which was, okay, I just spent 4 years learning all this stuff. Did or did it not prepare me very well for my career? And it feels like, I only have a few options in terms of where I could see myself going. And then like, okay, so I learned for 4 years and then I work for, 40 years. And that's just this idea of like, okay, I'm going to learn and then I'm going to go work for the rest of my life. And it just felt like we've got something a little bit mixed up in terms of how we think about lifelong education, because it just felt way too binary. Like you're in learning mode for 4 years, now you're working for 40 years. So that was about the time that I joined Degreed coming out of school. So that's kind of my...
David had some time to get it up and kind of starting to figure out, and then you started just going, you know what? I don't like this either. So I'm gonna help. I'm gonna jump on the train and help with that. So right. So you went and did Degreed, which has had tremendous success, continues to be crazy successful in the industry. And I remember, David, when you made the shift from, CEO, and then you were on the board, and then you went off and did that. And I think there were a fair amount of people that went, oh, he's moving on and, kind of cashing in on the success of that, and that'll be it. And then that's not the case. I mean, you've been involved with a lot of other things, but now learning is one of the new ones. Why? Like, why say, I'm just going to keep pushing it?
Yeah. So, I mean, I continue to serve as the chairman at Degreed, and I'm still very emotionally invested. Degreed was so hard to get launched and sort of birthed into the world, and it extracted a really large toll in my life and in our family. So I really didn't ever think, honestly, that I would leave. I mean, I'm deeply emotionally invested, and sort of, so much had to be laid on the sort of altar of sacrifice to make that all work.
You had to roll some rocks uphill with Degreed. I mean, I remember the early days of Degreed. I remember the early days of trying to explain to people what it was and why it mattered. And it just, people were like, huh?
Here we are with Learn In. And I think,
you thought, why not do it again?
People sort of mystified. And I think, and it's not, I'm not surprised by that. And it's because, it's so much easier to just, sort of take the better mousetrap approach to entrepreneurship, sort of LMS 2.0 or, performance management 2.0. I mean, just anything, and just kind of build the next version of it, or the better version of it. And that's how I think most startups actually do make their way in the world. And it's a totally fine way of evolving and iterating our way into better places. I think it's really different though. I mean, I said before, I tend to fall in love with the problem. And the problem with that is that, we're out there trying to solve a problem. It isn't like we set out to do X, Y, or Z, to be adjacent to this, or to compete with them, or to do better than, this, or to launch a new category. Like when you just set out to solve a problem, you sort of, it takes you wherever, the solution set, goes. And so I think that's the confusion people have always perceived in Degreed, and now with Learn In, is sort of like, well, what is it? What exactly is it that you're doing? What are you doing? Like, I don't get it.
Solving a problem. We haven't quite, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we're problem solving, and and that's part of why we're still at it, which is, Degreed is doing truly incredible work, and so are so many, others of this sort of generation. I mean, like, we're seeing Coursera go out in their IPO, and just thinking about sort of the accomplishments of ed tech of the last sort of 7 to 10 years. But like, the truth of the matter is, we're so far from solving all the problems. I mean, we're operating at such a minuscule scale in terms of upskilling. The costs of education are still inordinate. Sort of student debt is still climbing at, sort of spiraling rates. I mean, there's still just work to be done and problems to be solved. And, it's hard for me to imagine ever kind of, turning in my spurs. I mean, just like as long as there's problems out there, there's work to be done, and we got to keep at it.
You know, it's funny. I think sometimes there's this natural tendency for a lot of people is to be like, what? Well, when is it done? When do we get to the end? And I look at it in a similar mindset of, well, you're not, because the reality is the problems keep existing and everything keeps changing, and it just keeps evolving. So just when you think you've solved it,
Yeah.
something else is going to pop up, and you're going to have to solve that too. Which I get really excited about it. I think sometimes that's not always the attitude we have. And there are days when I'm not always super excited about it, but I get the gist.
Yeah, there's weight to it. And I mean, and part of, like, it isn't even like, how is learning different than Degreed? In so many ways, it's like Degreed and everyone else has been solving problems. So
Yep.
sort of in sequence. And
so let's talk about that. Like, let's transition to that piece, because we're talking about solving problems. So what were some of these problems that you went, we can do more, or this is another set of problems that we're going to try and tackle with this?
Yeah, I mean, Degreed came on the heels of, like, I think, to name two big shifts. One was information went from being scarce to accessible, and that's largely just the internet. And then specifically, Degreed came on the heels of education being democratized, and that's largely pointing at the MOOCs. And between those two things, Degreed was birthed at sort of this moment in time when the ecosystem had sort of codified around us. There was now accessibility and a wealth and an abundance, and kind of an early, but there was this Cambrian explosion of educational content going out into the world. And so, that created then both opportunity and need. And Degreed, arose to meet that, to help people curate it, to create search, to, be able to put it into pathways, to have it add up to something of merit, to be able to sort of score and credential and measure it, to be able to reflect it back to your employer, for employers to be able to make sense of it all. And so very natural order of things. And the work at Degreed is not done. The mission of Degreed is to jailbreak the degree, believe that skills are the currency of the future. And there is still great sort of important work to be done there. But I think, what's happened is, and it really is just an evolution. We're getting to now new questions and additional problems. And I think one of the really important ones is sort of equity and fairness, which is, corporate L&D has not ever been asked how equitable their programs are, not ever.
Nope.
And why not? Well, because 5 years ago, I mean, there was just such a burden of other problems, of just trying to mobilize education, of creating access to the education, of, trying to improve the ability to measure it in any way. Learning measurement historically is not awesome. It's not like we had an
What are you talking about?
Like we had an abundance of clarity, and so we are solving problems in sequence. But we've gotten to the point where now, in the rearview mirror, higher education was the predominant system of education and skilling of the workforce. But in, looking forward, through the windshield, corporate L&D, in a world of lifelong learning and, 100-year life and sort of longevity, we're going to learn more at the hands of corporate L&D than we will from our professors in universities. And so all of a sudden, we actually do need to start asking the questions of equity and access in corporate L&D, or risk a lot of unintended consequences and sort of systematic biases and hidden barriers. So that's just one example of and it's just here we are, and it's hard to look back and sort of blame our institutions of 5 years ago. I mean, it was just not. We didn't have the tooling. We didn't have, we weren't.
No, and I think that's a fair point. I think sometimes in our industry, it can get very easy to kind of beat up on the way it was done. Like, oh, it's so ridiculous that, we aren't here yet, or we didn't do this. And it's like, well, honestly, 5-10 years ago, some of the things that we can do very easily now, they weren't, they were possible, but they were just so ridiculously resource intensive, or just unsustainable, that it was impossible to actually do it. And I think, to your point, and I think it's a good point, we're now reaching this apex where some of these things that were impossibilities now, they're kind of table stakes. And now we're kind of in this next generation of saying, okay, well, that kind of under control. Well, that's now revealing the problems were there before. I think that's one of the things. The stuff, it's not like it wasn't a problem before. It's just we didn't have capacity to even see the forest through the trees. And now that we're backing up and getting through some of this, we're going, oops, we've got some other problems that we've still got to tackle. And I think there's a greater organizational awareness that I like your point about the fact that corporate L&D is going to be responsible for the development of people as a whole, probably more than their institution or wherever they got their undergrad.
It used to be this, component of our careers that was almost inconsequential, in large part because it was so compliance driven. It was for the company's sake. It was never about us. It was never about our development. It was never about our learning. It was never about our careers. It was never about our future. But that's slowly shifted. And, increasingly it will be a meaningful part of, who gets the right skills, who is sort of qualified for opportunities, who is, given promotions, and who is sort of, mobilized to become leaders. So much of that is going to now be dependent on the quality of lifelong education that you get, the quality of corporate training and skilling that you get.
Okay. All right. So I got a question for you, Taylor, because I'm going to redirect this one. So if you bump into somebody and you say, yeah, I'm co-founding Learnin, or I work for Learnin now. Mm-hmm. How do you explain it to somebody in an elevator?
Sure. We help companies build their internal talent. So that's what Learnin does.
Okay.
And, a couple things there. Sort of Degreed, we talked a lot about skills.
Okay.
Skills were, the atomic unit of, you're learning this content, it's building up into skills. Learnin, we're approaching it more from, and a lot of people are familiar with Degreed. So if I'm talking to someone from L&D, I'll say, do you know Degreed? Great. I always describe Degreed as the sort of the smaller stuff, right? The articles, the videos, the books, the podcasts, the just in time, in the flow of work, I have 20 minutes, like give me something to learn.
Okay.
Well, Learnin is it's the bigger stuff. It's I don't just want to iterate on my skills. I want to develop a new skill set.
Okay.
And I think that's and it's a hard challenge. So we're approaching that with, Learnin is about enabling the bigger, the longer form, more intensive learning experiences, the ones that take more time, more commitment, a business case, this, and it really is about talent. It's not about, we need you to teach, this very specific behavior or how to use this very specific tool. It's, thinking about, do we have data science talent inside of our organization? Great. So it's talent building with an eye towards how do we do that in an inclusive way, as Dave has sort of mentioned.
Okay. Well, what's interesting is back to the conversation about your journey in the ed tech learning tech space. It's kind of a similar comparison in the sense of it's not a better mousetrap for your skills. It's not I'm pretty good at this, but I need to just kind of sharpen my blade or catch up on some of the latest trends along the skills that I already have. It's this differentiation of, hey, I've got a fundamental new thing and I need to build that skill from the ground up, which I think this is one of the things that our industry has missed over the years in some regards, is the fact that that's a lot of work. Like, you can't micro learning your way into building a new skill from the ground up. There's no, 30-second YouTube clips you can watch on repeat and then magically you have a fundamental understanding of how to actually build AI algorithms when you were whatever. I have no idea what to compare it to, but it's just that's a big workload for the individual and for the enterprise to actually make that kind of investment.
And they're just different. It's like so much, all the how-to, and there's great, incredible how-to sort of stuff now on almost every field and industry out there. But it's like, watching a 7-minute video on how to replace my disposal, in my sink doesn't make me a plumber.
Right.
It just doesn't. And that's the difference. Now, that isn't to say that these on-demand 7-minute videos that sort of get you unstuck and can step you through and teach you something, It's just a different problem.
Yep.
And so, Degreed really was in the flow of work. It's the, on average, employers give employees like 24 minutes a week on average to learn. And Degreed is all about maximizing that. World Economic Forum says it takes 480 hours to learn a skill. And if you just start breaking down the problems of developing a skill over 480 hours, it has its own set of challenges, and they're immense. And so that's what's driven Learn-In into coaching. And how do you scaffold that? How do you, block the time? It's actually something that higher education had to figure out a really long time ago. Cohorting, synchronous, sort of accountability, checkpoints, application. All of those things are good, ways of scaffolding someone over a very long journey and getting good results out of that very long journey. But when it comes to us as lifelong learners, the truth of the matter is that most of us are pretty ill prepared to go on a 480-hour journey in the middle of our life on our own to upskill ourselves, even with the encouragement or support of our employer. No one ever taught us how. The system really didn't. And so a 480-hour journey is tough, and it's going to take a whole bunch of kind of solutioning and help.
Well, and I think that is, and again, I don't think it necessarily was I think there's parts of that are new problems that didn't exist with the workforce before, as skills have degraded faster, as kind of this idea of you could get your degree and you could go get a job and you could just do it on repeat for 40 years. The stable
knowledge, apply it over 40 years.
Just apply it on repeat. And now it's you can't do that. And in some regards, that's a new problem that, to your point, people are now going, well, what the heck am I supposed to do with this? And I wasn't prepared to do that. So it's an interesting challenge. And I think the other point you hit on that is a good one to highlight is it's not a one's good or one's bad. To your plumbing example, there's nothing wrong with, it's good that you can look up, how do I quickly replace my garbage disposal? Because you probably don't need to be a plumber to swap out your garbage disposal. So that kind of problem, it's okay to solve with that kind of thing. If you're trying to redo the plumbing in your whole house because your basement flooded, you probably don't want to be doing a series of YouTube videos hoping that you get it right and hope that after you drywall everything shut, I really hope it worked, because this, if that's the kind of accountability, I think that whole seeking out what problem are you trying to solve, that's a degree of effort that we on the corporate L&D side, we need to put that through our front end more to say, hey, how are we actually evaluating this? Because there's not a right or wrong answer. It's what problem are we trying to solve? And then what are we actually applying to solve it?
Yeah.
Okay. Go for it. Well, so let me ask you this question, because it's a good one. And Toby brought it up. All right. And because we're kind of treading into the challenges piece, but we'll come back and forth because I've got a lot of things that I want to go for with this one. But this is a real challenge that people face is, okay, so we made this investment, we did this, we tried to tackle this with over here, and now we've got to go back to the well and say, remember how maybe you thought that we were going to do this and it was going to solve all our problems? That wasn't quite accurate. And now we need to talk about doing this more. And it's not a trade-off. It's not now we dump all this stuff we were doing before, free up the funds, and now we put them over here. It's no, we keep investing here because that's still a really important capability, and we need to layer this on. How are you seeing organizations work through that challenge?
Yeah. Well, first, I'll say I have a lot of conversations with people where I'll ask them about their upskilling needs and what they're doing. And a lot of times I'll just come out of it and say, honestly, you need Degreed, or you need something like Degreed. That is, based on what you're telling me, that's where you should start. But a lot of times, right, there is this additional need in these longer form skill building type experiences. And instead of it feeling like, gosh, well, here's an extra thing that we now have to do, we talk to it a lot in terms of your tuition assistance program. So here's something that you're already doing that we think you can reposition a little bit, make it more strategic, and to align it to this new set of needs that we're talking about. Because tuition assistance really is, hey, we're going to help pay for our employees, go do 2 or 4 year degree programs.
Yep. And then make them sign a thing that says you're going to stay for 4 years after you do it.
Right, right. And there's all sorts of things that are kind of messed up with tuition assistance today. And most companies will admit, like, oh, for tuition assistance, we haven't looked at our policy since like the 90s. But you know, they spend a bunch of money on it, and we say, great, like, don't think of this as necessarily net new. Let's talk about tuition assistance and, you know, the spend that's already happening, and how can we reposition that against, you know, shorter, more targeted, more skill-oriented programs that are aligned to the needs of the business.
Okay.
So that's one way of thinking about it, is not, here's an extra thing you have to do, but let's figure out how to make tuition assistance better, because tuition assistance can cover a lot of kind of what we're talking about.
Okay. Got it. Well, and that makes sense, because most organizations have some sort of program in place. There is spend going to that type of thing. And honestly, I don't think I've been in a single conversation in the history of ever where I've said, how happy are you with the success of your tuition reimbursement program? And companies go, we love it. Literally everything it's a success. People get exactly what they want out of it. We get what we want out of it. It is money well spent. I don't think that conversation has happened to date. And maybe I'm just in the wrong conversations. But I think the opportunity to say, hey, what if we could use that capability, that potential that we're trying to tap into, let's use it better, so that rather than something where, you know, it's not really getting you much, people aren't necessarily really happy with it, we're only touching a fraction of the population, like, let's actually do something and actually benefit the organization as well. So the question I have as a follow-up, well, actually Toby had it, but I have a way I'm reframing this, is you talk about, you know, creating greater equity for these type of opportunities. And I think one of the risks or challenges with the traditional model of tuition reimbursement was it wasn't always super accessible for everybody. It was not always super accessible for everybody. And so it, in some ways, almost reinforced continued bias of, oh, well, we have special programs for our high potentials, which is the tiny fraction of the population who we then invest in for these kinds of things. So from the democratization of it, keeping in that same mindset, how do you see organizations tackling that challenge? Because that's a real risk that you could say, hey, these are our special programs for upskilling, and now we've kind of killed the democratization capability of it.
Yeah. I can start, Taylor, if you have any thoughts. You know, there's this, organizations have sort of placated themselves in that, you know, tuition assistance is sort of universally accessible. And so ergo, it's easy to think of it as universal, that right. That it's accessible to everyone. So ergo, everyone benefits sort of evenly and fairly.
I mean, that's a faulty assumption a lot of organizations make. They're like, well, anybody can do it, so technically it's fair.
And this is where it gets into, we just haven't been measuring, but kind of the truth of the matter is that, there's hidden barriers and biases that lie beyond that, which is, engaging in a 4-year program. Most tuition programs are reimbursement. And so you still have to have enough cash in your bank account to go and pay tuition and float it for, 5 months and then be reimbursed. A lot of companies put grade level sort of stipulations on it. So then it's at risk. So if I end up getting, a C+ in one of my classes, does that risk me not getting reimbursed? And, and so all of a sudden anyone who can't, float a $4,000 tuition and payment, or risk a $4,000 reimbursement no longer participates. And then there's the biggest barrier to upskilling is time, and it is not, born equally by all. I mean, if you're a parent, you have different demands. If you're a caretaker, you have different demands. If you're a single parent, you have different demands. If you have a long commute, you have different demands. If you have a second job, you have different demands than if you are single, than if you are married with a stay-at-home, spouse. Like it just isn't born equally. And so part of what we see is in these kind of open and accessible to all upskilling programs or tuition kind of programs, that participation is biased towards those who have the time and those who don't get left behind. And so we're leaving behind, again, caretakers and parents and those with a second job. So we just have to be kind of more thoughtful in how we engineer this and sort of solution for it.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll add, I think a couple of things have really helped. One is that, development today doesn't mean sending your employees to a top tier MBA program that costs $200,000.
Right.
That's how a lot of companies have thought about it. But now there's a new ecosystem of programs and experiences and certificate programs and coaching that the price has come way, way down, right? I mean, you can find these really high quality programs that don't cost tens of thousands of dollars. Maybe they cost a couple $1,000s. So it's companies need to update their policies to allow for this new age type of skill building program, because they cost less, more people can participate, they're shorter. Not everyone, if you're limiting, if you're saying like, gosh, you've got to go back and get a master's degree or a 4-year degree, like who's ready to sign up for that? Not very many people, right?
Well, yes. And on top of that, especially like we just talked about some of the challenges that people have with that. And again, a lot of times for companies to make that kind of investment, that's where you have the clawback clauses where you say, well, if we're going to invest this kind of money, we need to know that there's this time and we don't really know how else to measure this. So we're going to do this, which again, just restricts the inclusion and access to this kind of stuff. So, I think it's an interesting capability, and some of the comments coming in are really talking about the fact that, hey, the opportunity to repurpose tuition reimbursement in a more meaningful way it's value add to both the university side of things, right? The actual providers of these skill capabilities and the organizations and it's really a win on all fronts. I see it this way anyway. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So my question with this one, as you look at this, and I think this gets back to, now I remember where I was going with this. This gets back to the why you can't throw out the degrees or some of these other efforts in the mix, because one of the challenges is, at least my take, and feel free to cut me off or if you have something to add to this, one of the things that's adding value to that actually almost sets the table for what we're talking about is to maximize this, you need to understand your workforce and the needs of the skills within your workforce so that these different options, you can apply them intelligently instead of just force fitting people into a single option, or even if you have a suite of options, just kind of packing people in and being able to help connect, hey, based on our workforce, based on the needs of the organization, the desires of the workforce, let's actually match and pair people to these things intelligently, because some people might need an MBA. Some people might not. Some people might need a certification in an IT skill that doesn't take that kind of time and resources. So you can't just have one option and blindly throw people into it. But to me, that seems where there's this natural pairing between the two, and it's not you throw one out and you replace it with this, because otherwise you're just doing it without the data you need to actually do it wise.
Yeah, and I mean, Degreed fulfills a very unique position in the ecosystem, which is, it built the thing that can, marry your small arc learning, your daily, weekly, monthly with your quarterly programs, your, semi-annual, and, performance reviews, your, fall and spring high potential or manager trainings, your annual performance reviews or, development planning, your career planning, your mobility planning, how in Degreed, sitting underneath Degreed is content and assessment and all of these point solutions. And, part of what we saw was there was white space. There was a need that wasn't being well served. And that really, it's not even the biggest arc. I mean, college degrees, a master's degree is a 2-year program. That's a bigger arc than what we're talking about. We're saying the white space is there's a need in stuff that's bigger than a course. The truth of the matter is taking, one course does not a data scientist make.
What?
Taking
How dare you, Dave?
Taking that Coursera course did not turn you into a data scientist.
I can't believe that. I have my certificate printed here. I was going to go take on that. Well, you just ruined my afternoon.
And, and then there are college degrees out there. There's the 2-year, advanced degrees. There's the 4-year undergraduate degrees. And sort of in between those spaces, there was a lot of white space and in enterprise. And what we saw in sort of the consumer ecosystem, solutioning had emerged. There's income sharing agreements that deal with a lot of the cost sort of issues. There's coaching solutions that have, as Taylor said, the price has come way down, the scale has come way up. Sort of these boot camps and certificate programs have really, proliferated over the last several years. And so sort of once again, we saw this white space. We want to help enterprise organizations be able to unlock, new efficiencies and drive to more skill outcomes with it. But all of this would still sit under your Degreed, implementation. Like Learn-In is integrated with Degreed. And Degreed at the end of the day is still the system that brings, this kind of long form arc, and lets it sit aside alongside your medium-sized arc and your, monthly sized arcs and your weekly sized arcs and your daily arcs.
Okay. I like that. The reason I'm smirking a little bit is when you said Learn-In's integrated with Degreed, I was actually chuckling because if you had said like, well, it's not, but I actually would have laughed pretty hard. But anyway, so it makes sense. It makes sense because it does. It's all fitting together, and it goes back to a conversation I had with Matt Donovan. I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, where we were talking about this is what we're talking about when we talk about the ecosystem, and the fact that this isn't this just universal single solution or single set of solutions that you just kind of quickly whip together. There's white space, there's narrow space, there's big, there's a lot of complexity behind this. And to our earlier point from the beginning of the conversation, this is only going to grow.
Continue.
The whole model of coming out of school is not your end. That is, if anything, the starting line for the rest of your development. And that's not a choice you really get to make anymore, where you go, well, I'm a lifelong learner. Well, guess what? We're all a lifelong learner, and if you're not, you're in trouble. Like you are, you just don't know it yet.
By necessity, we all are, sure.
That's just it. It's not a nice option you get to choose anymore. Instead, it's more of a baseline requirement. So with this one, the other question I have, and I think it's an interesting kind of perspective that I'd like from you on this, what you've seen with organizations you work with, is kind of this balance. And I think it's a constant balancing act, or at least in my experience, it's been in this, there's what the employer needs, and there's what the employee and workforce needs. And it's this constant continuum of figuring out how do we serve that in a way that we're not only thinking about the employer, but we're not only thinking about the employee in this kind of hoop around, whatever you want to do, just do it. It's totally cool. Where do you help organizations, or how do you approach that to help find that right balance so that you're investing your dollars in a wise way, but in a way that's matching both?
Yeah. So the way that we've built Learn-In is to really, it can scale up or down, right? In terms of, we really want it to be a tool for companies to say, these are the skills that we need. And then we say, great, what does that actually mean in terms of, because we ultimately want to translate this into, here's development opportunities aligned to internal resources of time and money and support. So it's the company. So our tools say, hey, company, you need data scientists. Great. What does that mean in terms of the time and the financing and the support that you're going to give your employees to participate in these programs? And we help them inform that. And it can be at different levels. So companies might say, we really need data scientists. So we're going to subsidize a program. We're going to give you as much support as we can, give you some time to participate at work. We're going to give you a completion bonus at the end. And then, but maybe, for project management, yeah, we sort of need project management. We're going to sort of subsidize it up to this level. And then there's some things that, hey, it really doesn't align to the needs of what we as a company need right now. So if you want to go, learn how to be X, Y, or Z, we'll give you the support we can, but we're not really subsidizing that type of development. So the company can come in at different levels. And I think it's important for the company to be able to communicate that to their employees, because I've had some really sad conversations where someone's saying, I'm trying to, improve my career prospects at my company. So I go into a master's program in something. I get done. No one cares. And all of a sudden, I'm realizing oh shoot, like I just went and spent 3 years and all this time and energy learning something that my company
Does not care about.
doesn't care about. And it's like, that's okay if that's where you wanted to go, but your company owes you and should communicate like, hey, this is where we really have talent needs internally.
Okay.
And this is, where we sort of, and this is kind of like, not so much, and different levels.
You want to do it for your own personal development. We're supportive of that, but it's not necessarily going to be something that's going to
exactly
career mobility for you.
Yeah. Employees should not have to guess, right? They shouldn't have to guess, like, I'm going to do this thing. What is it going to, does it align to what my company needs? So I think that's kind of the biggest thing.
Okay. Well, and I think the transparency behind that is an important piece. I think there's a lot of complexities that go into where that comes from. Some of it is, I think sometimes organizations just struggle to know what to do with their people in terms of mobility. I think that's where we're seeing the career mobility side of things really pick up in the industry right now, is the fact that it's actually solving a problem for organizations that have historically struggled with, we don't know where the opportunity to send people is, other than job descriptions. We don't really know what's going on. And so when somebody does finish a data science program, we're like, do we have anything in our careers thing? No. Oh, shoot. Like, what do we do now? And I think this is where we're creating greater opportunity for that kind of mobility. Okay. So let me ask you this, because this will help me break down where you're playing in this, is for what you're doing with this, because I'm framing up in my head how I picture this if I were to categorize it.
Yeah.
Before I put it in a category, because I don't think it is a category that really exists. The white space you described, David, is it's an ether right now. I don't personally see a lot of people playing in that space at all. And I talk to a lot of people. Are you playing in the space of you're creating those upskilling, like you're creating the infrastructure? Is it you're curating that from the different places where all these come together so that organizations can make a smarter play? Is it, where do you fit in, where will you fit, or where do you vision seeing you fit in that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the curse that I'm, called to carry, I guess. I mean, and the honest answer is like, I don't know. I mean, we're just solving the problems. Okay. I mean, like, break the problem down, and I don't know. I mean, like trying to get people through a 480-hour journey with a high-quality program, with the support they need, with the time that they need, aligned with sort of an outcome and the ability to apply it. How do we categorize that? Is it curation? Like, we aren't developing, so one, we're not developing content. We're not developing the skill programming. So at that level, it's curation. But it's much more than just sort of the marketplace of programs. Like, that's a useful value add, but that's not meaningfully, literally that's the decision point that comes before you even start your 480 hours.
Yes.
That's like kind of which pathway am I going to go, take and spend 480 hours on. So we really are trying to take people from that decision point, help you find a program that's well aligned, and then we're trying to take the organization and their ability to support the person, us supporting the person, the person getting through the 480-hour journey, and ideally all the way through to like a promotion or unlocking, actual opportunity on the other side of it.
Okay. Well, and I think that I'll let you kind of keep going on this one, but I think if I'm understanding correctly, and it makes sense, you're still to some degree figuring some of the nuts and bolts of this stuff out as you're going, but it's not, we're going out and we're creating all of these programs specifically for these different degree, the degree alternative, the white space thing. We're designing and architecting all the content behind that, because I think, but at the same time, it's also not just we're just going and finding all these ones and then just bringing it together, because again, that still doesn't necessarily address the challenge that organizations face of, well, if you just needed a marketplace, this problem would solve itself. And solving this problem is much more complicated than just saying, hey, here's a whole suite of things. Let's throw a little AI on it and match people up and, be eHarmony for the next gen of career development.
Yeah, there's most of these programs have existed almost exclusively direct to consumer, and that's just because the model hasn't yet found its home in enterprise. And why not? And behind that why not is a whole bunch of kind of structural issues, policy issues, behavioral, corporate behaviors that like we are trying to help organizations see, recognize, us create solutions that help account for. And so that, it's kind of the moment in, Apollo 13 where it's, they've got the square tube that has to make it in the round hole, and they've got 119 pieces of scrap fabric that they have to like engineer to get these two things to fit together. And and that's a lot of what we're doing right now. I mean, it's interesting, it's fascinating. It's not exactly like, this is not lean startup, Eric Ries, the actual lean startup book and philosophy. Like, this is not the easiest way of building a startup.
No.
And part of what we're having to do is go inside organizations, and I mean, it's and break down just like internal silos, because like you've got L&D who has historically owned the skilling agenda, but then a lot of these dollars sit in with the benefits that education benefits and the tuition assistance manager, and sometimes those sit in the same organization. More often than not,
it's rare.
They don't. And so it's like, hey, you could do so much better for your people, for your objectives, for the business. You could do so much better if we can coordinate, if you can unlock these dollars, if you can apply it in a new way, but again, it's just new. It's just hard. We're breaking down silos. We're solutioning what sits behind it. What I hope is this is a tough kind of journey, but there's so much value truly that sits behind this. I mean, like, most companies spend more on their education benefits than they do on their L&D per employee. And so like, I mean, if we can help companies, they're already spending this in tuition assistance, and they're already spending this in, L&D. Right now, L&D has actually undergone a lot of transformation, a lot of disruption. It's been really quite made fairly efficient relative to the solutions that the market has to offer.
Yep.
Now, education benefits has not. Like, as Taylor said, a lot of companies haven't re-examined it since the 90s. Like, it's a 30-year-old, legacy system that's being spent on, I firmly believe the absolute worst thing you can spend tuition assistance on is college tuition. Like, pound for pound, dollar for dollar, that is the lowest ROI, way you can go and send anyone to gain knowledge or skill. The absolute worst. And yet that's how 99% of all those dollars, and they are substantive dollars, are being spent. So.
Well, no, and the thing about it is, and what you're talking about should be, while it could feel overwhelming to learning professionals, like, oh my word, are you kidding right now? It's also very exciting because the position and the potential we have as an organization is huge. And I think historically we've kind of accepted that we were just this little like, well, we just kind of do our thing over here, and we want a seat at the table and all this stuff. And it's like, that opportunity now is creating itself in many, many, many different ways. Some are just where we are in the optimization and the efficiency we're getting at. Some are what you're talking about, is we can tap into new funding, new things, new aspects of things that were historically outside our camp, and forge that together. I think I talked about this maybe, I don't know, it was a couple of months ago, was the same thing on customer education. You start talking about how organizations can leverage this for customer development and the revenue generation potential out of that. I mean, there's a ton of potential in this space right now for people who are willing to embrace it and go, we got to think outside the box here, and we can do some massive, powerful things if we really lean into it.
I'll give it back to you to, you coined the phrase, man. Name the category. Like, degreed, birthed and created and leads the LXP category. But like, that is not, we didn't come up with that name. I mean, that was everyone else trying to understand and put words.
Don't ask me to create another category. I think people are having a hard enough time.
We will give it to you. You tell us what.
Oh yeah, there we go.
All this.
I'll noodle on that one for a bit, and I'll get back to you.
Yeah.
So
Chris,
what other question? Go for it.
Let me just add one thing.
Yeah, no.
Talking about the silos between L&D and benefits, I mean, I think the real thing that we need to drive towards is helping organizations think in terms of, in terms of the problems.
Yeah.
So if the problem is we need to develop our people, we need to invest in our talent, we need to take someone from here to here, like, let's frame it in terms of that. Let's not frame it in terms of, what should our tuition assistance policy be? What should, hey, how are we going to, administer our LMS? Like, we need to think in terms of these problems, because there are these silos, and there are people who are thinking, they've got their blinders on to their specific challenges. And this like holistic employee development building talent risks getting lost between these different categories and stakeholders.
It does. Well, and I think this is where the complete reframing of what learning and development is we're reaching a point where we almost have to, because what learning and development is no longer what it will be, and it's in the past. And I think this whole idea of we are the people development engine of the organization, and that then spans across the horizontal, because it's like, well, that's not tied to a function or a silo or a business unit. That's tied to an enterprise initiative that does have tremendous value to an organization, because no matter who you talk to as a business leader, nobody says we don't need to develop our people because the business is changing and we need to get them on board. They may not use our L&D buzzwords and terminology, but they're saying the same thing. They know that the market's changing, things are evolving, and that the people need to know how to get on board with that. They just don't necessarily always know how to articulate it. So I think it's interesting, where you're going with this. And I appreciate the transparency behind we're working through exactly how this will all go. But based on the comments and just my own take on it, for what it's worth, it is a huge hole. It's a huge hole in organizations. And I think it's something that there's tremendous opportunity to fit. So where does this leave you today, as organizations are stepping into this? Like, what's a good starting? That'll be my final question, because I've got about 473 more that I could ask, but I'm not going to, because otherwise we'll be here for the remainder of the day. But for organizations that are starting, maybe hear this, or they're going, you know what, snap. Like, you're right. This is something that maybe we should start thinking about. How do you advise them to start treading into this territory to say, all right, we know we probably need to think outside of this. We aren't really sure where to start. We don't want to get hung up on analysis paralysis type of thing. Like, where to begin?
Yeah, the good news here is that, especially when it comes to tuition assistance, it's so inefficient that we can gain efficiencies and cost savings almost from, like the first hour of sort of breaking this problem down. Okay. So that should give a lot of people confidence, which is, this is an area for material, either spend the same amount and get more for it, or try and accomplish the same outcomes and spend less. So, we really do believe that this can be a very big driver in cost savings or in increased skill output. But look, we need those kind of pioneering spirits who are interested in, who have the stakeholders, who have the champions internally, who, recognize that this is a truth, that, there's utility and value for the individuals and for the organization if, the organization's willing to do the hard work of breaking down some of these barriers and engaging in this work holistically. Degreed went 3 years. We existed January 2012. The first enterprise client was January 2015. And it would have gone years longer if it wasn't for the pioneering spirits of one of our first partners. And that's what it takes. This is, I've come to appreciate that sort of, there's no fixing these problems in a laboratory. We've got to work in partnership to make these things real. And so I'd welcome anyone who's listening here, if you feel like you've got, kind of the energy inside of your organization to engage in this work and drive to those improved outcomes, we'd love to just, partner with you.
Cool. Well, and I think that's a really it's a great place to end too, but I think that gives it a very tangible, actionable thing where it's not, because I think the tendency would be to think like, oh gosh, I've got to go try and drum up business stakeholders. It might be as simple as saying, hey, let's take a look at what we're doing with our tuition reimbursement right now. Let's take a look at that and see if maybe we could be doing better, getting more out of it, spending less, whatever that is. Let's see if we can maximize that. And that now becomes a tangible thing that you can action against. It opens the conversation that most likely, I don't know a lot of orgs that are going to go, no, we're perfectly fine with it. Don't touch it. It's great. Leave it alone. Okay.
Well,
Well, with that, we are, what's that?
Appreciate it.
All right. Well, we're out of time. So thank you both for joining me. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Hopefully this got your noodle, rolling, or whatever term you want to use to get you thinking about things. And you found some value in it. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you both joining me, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Thanks everybody for watching.
Thank you. See ya.